Hey, you got that easy cheesy? That's cool. We can pull that up. Roll up some of that good.
Sitting by the open fireplace in my favorite dungarees. Played a few bars of a melody and it sound.
Okay, today I wanted to talk about drug trafficking and money laundering through the music industry. Now, drug distribution has its challenges. You got to get that product to the suppliers. Death Row Records had jets and cars traveling around the country with armed police escorts. Death Row Records solved that supply problem. Death Row Records created One Stop, which was an automobile modification company that put secret compartments into the vehicles. Now, tours also required sound and lighting equipment that was transported around the country, and drugs could also travel with the gear. Now, Death Row Records has ties to drugs. Michael Harry O. Harris put up the money to start Death Row Records. Freeway Ricky Ross was Harry O's cellmate at the time that money was put up. Freeway Ricky Ross ties to Blandone, and that also ties to Oliver North in the Iran-Contra scandal as documented by Gary Webb and Michael Rupert. Reggie Wright Jr. worked for Death Row Records. He had been known to control the drug trade in Compton and to rob drug dealers. Rafael Perez had been known to work for Death Row Records, and he was convicted of stealing and dealing cocaine. Now, the music industry also ties to drugs. Interscope Records had been on the fringe of many drug rings. Universal had deep ties to the mafia through Jules Stein and Lew Wasserman. And you can reference Reagan, MCA, and the mob. Now, one day I'll probably tell you I have some personal knowledge about that, as I produced movies with somebody who was tied to Lew Wasserman. Ronald Reagan gave MCA a blanket SAG waiver to continue in the agency business while producing television. This was a severe competitive advantage over other television production companies. How was drug money laundered? Piles of drug cash needed to be laundered to become legitimate assets. A Universal home video scam that gives us some insight. Sales were inflated, so if a recording artist sold 50 million albums, 100 million would be booked. 100 million albums, that is. Money from the fake retailers would remit payments for albums that never existed, and that money found its way into the coffers of the company. Now, the duplicators that shipped those albums to the fake retailers would be paid for the albums that never existed. So at that point, the money was all put into the system and it became legitimate, and it could be used to do whatever they wanted to do. They could use it for political campaigns. That was probably one of the major uses of that illegitimate money that was legitimized. So who made Tupac famous? Dan Quayle is the one that called out Tupac from the pulpit and said there's no place for his lyrics in our society. Dan Quayle is tied to the Iran-Contra scandal with Oliver North. And when Tupac died, he only had $6,000 in his checking account, having never been properly paid for creating some of the most popular seminal music. Now, Interscope is owned by Ted Field, one of the early supporters of Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas when drugs were being flown to Mena, Arkansas by Barry Seal, and guns were being flown to the Contras in Nicaragua. Seal's planes tied back to George Herbert Walker Bush. And then we get to Compton as a drug hub. Compton had 6 military surplus helicopters, and they got those from the U.S. government. Now, why does a city of 10 square miles need 6 police helicopters? Yep, drug smuggling. From Compton, those drugs could be distributed nationwide by Death Row Records and other music companies in the equipment traveling on tour and the planes that transported the artists. And both George Herbert Walker Bush and George W. Bush once lived in Compton. When I found that out, I was very skeptical, and I fact-checked it, and sure enough, they lived in Compton. So I hope this kind of gives you some insight into what was going on, the business behind the business. There was an investigation that was going on into death row records, and that investigation pretty much proved that drugs and money laundering was happening, but no charges were ever brought, and that investigation was abandoned. So wonder why? Probably told by somebody higher up, hey, don't look here, nothing to see here, move along.
Swish sweet tastes good between my lips. Wishing I could make it out when I reminisce. The world's so messed up and devilish. I'm just sitting back pouring up, man. I'm running out of drink, you know. My thoughts is flying. I feel like I need another bottle. I know I don't need it, but this bottle helped me through tomorrow. All the sorrow and pain I see on our women's faces, man, it's like, damn. I done ran out of drink, ran out of money. Now I'm just meditating, getting my mind right, trying to deal with this. But I miss my brandy, man. I need some of that brown, that E&J, that Parmesan. Damn. DJ